In the early 2000s, there was a vehicle that, wherever it went, made a parking lot go quiet for a few seconds. The Hummer. It wasn't just an SUV. It was a piece of steel military uniform, a declaration that you wanted to take over the lane, take over the gaze. The body was square like an ammo crate. Big tires, high ground clearance, moving like it had just come back from the desert. People called it cool in a cold, no explanation needed way. The Hummer appeared alongside names that made the tabloids' cameras flash. Mike Tyson, Britney Spears, and a whole lineup of other stars. At a time when America was still obsessed with things that were big and seemingly invincible, owning a Hummer felt like carrying a shield. Part show of force, part reassurance. But this story has a sharp twist. What was once a symbol of street power vanished after just a few years. By 2010, Hummer had ceased production entirely. So what happened right then? The seeds of its decline were already quietly taking root. After the Vietnam War, the U.S. military began to look back at the legendary Jeep with a respect tinged with worry. The Jeep had done its duty in a different era. But now it was showing its limits. Not enough pulling power when carrying heavy loads. Not enough protection as firepower and threats grew more complex. The military needed something that wasn't just a vehicle, but a platform that could shift with the mission. Carrying troops, carrying cargo, towing equipment, mounting communication systems, and most importantly, increasing the survivability of the people inside. As the 1980s began, the Pentagon pushed a large-scale replacement program. This wasn't about picking a new model and painting it military green. It was a ground-up design built to handle every scenario. The result was a contract worth about $1 billion signed with AM General. Out of it came a name as long as a line of text in a technical document: High Mobility Multi-Purpose Wheeled Vehicle. But the troops didn't use the terminology. They shortened it to a word that sounded tight, hard, and very metal. Humvee. It was bigger, wider, better at carrying loads, and more flexible in its roles. It could be a troop carrier. It could be a logistics vehicle. It could be a command vehicle. And when needed, it could carry weapons like an extension of its body. Its body and structure were built for endurance, so that when the wheels rolled over rock, sand, and the potholes of war, what remained in the end wasn't beauty, but the mission still moving forward. As the early 1990s arrived, the Humvee no longer sat quietly inside bases. The Gulf War put it on television day after day, square-bodied, high-clearance convoys grinding across the desert as if nothing could stop them. Arnold Schwarzenegger was filming Kindergarten Cop at the time. During a trip through Oregon, he saw a convoy of military Humvees in real life. Tires grinding, the vehicles moving like walking blocks of steel. For Arnold, it wasn't just cool like some new toy. It stirred an old memory from his time in the Austrian army, when he had driven tanks and grown used to the feeling of commanding a heavy machine that obeyed without hesitation. Some people looked at the Humvee and saw war. Arnold looked and saw mechanical power, the kind of feeling that slows your heartbeat down with confidence. And he didn't stop at admiring it. Arnold began pushing AM General to build a civilian version, something that could roll through city streets, not just across the desert. It was a pivotal shove. When an Alice star talks about a vehicle as if it's a symbol, that machine instantly gains a new life. The result came faster than anyone expected. AM General agreed to produce the civilian version, and Arnold became the first civilian to own a Humvee with Terminator printed on it and legally drive it on the road. The year 1992 marked a turning point. The Hummer officially went on sale. The price could reach $100, sold, a number that made a lot of people hold their breath at the time. But Hummer buyers weren't paying for comfort. They were paying for the feeling of owning something like no one else. Behind the wheel, you didn't feel like you were driving a luxury vehicle. You felt like you were operating a piece of working equipment. The seating position was high. The view like standing on an observation platform. The body was wide and angular, and every steering input felt like you were ordering a heavy machine to change direction, not gliding smoothly like a sedan on the freeway. The interior wasn't the kind with leather upholstery, glossy wood, and that new car perfume. It was blunt, utilitarian, sometimes lacking even what Americans would call luxury. But in return, the Hummer delivered a feeling of invincibility, as if you could drive straight through anything without asking permission. The price you paid was at the gas station. Fuel economy was rumored to be under 10 milliliters per gallon, and curb weight could climb to around 10,000 Lauenlib. Those numbers turned the Hummer into a giant creature. Even the tax system got bent by its weight. Because it was so heavy, there was a time when owners could exploit a loophole to register it as farm equipment in order to claim tax deductions like agricultural equipment. Additionally, there's an interesting detail on the dashboard. There used to be a starter button labeled Fire, a word that made people flinch because it was too real, too direct. Later, the company's lawyers required it to be removed. In 1999, the Hummer entered a new chapter when General Motors acquired the commercial rights from AM General. And if before that, the Hummer was like a quirky product for a small number of people bold enough to go for it, then under GM, it was put onto the assembly line of popular culture. The timing was almost perfect. The US economy was booming. Gas prices were still manageable, and consumers were obsessed with anything big and tall. Something that looked powerful at a glance. GM saw the Hummer not just as a vehicle, but as a symbol that could be packaged and sold along with the American dream. Hummer's marketing under GM wasn't simply advertising. The vehicles appeared densely throughout films as if they belonged on the big screen long before they ever had license plates. In some years, the Hummer was seen in dozens of movies. And every time it rolled through the frame, the message was the same. This was a machine for the strong, the bold, the ones who didn't want to blend into the crowd. But what truly made the Hummer explode also lay in the social psychology of the time. After the Gulf War, the image of the Humvee had become a piece of collective memory, military convoys, as a symbol of American power, of the ability to deploy and control. So, for a segment of customers, owning a Hummer wasn't just buying a vehicle. It was like a personal act of patriotism, a way to bring a military symbol back to the home front. Alongside patriotism was another seductive illusion: survival. The Hummer sold a guttural sense of safety like a rolling fortress. In an era when America was both confident and uneasy, this vehicle gave people a feeling of control. Higher, bigger, heavier, as if that alone could make all the risks out there seem smaller. When GM had turned the Hummer into a name everyone knew, they kept expanding the lineup to sell more to more people, while still preserving that essence that made everyone look twice. The H2 arrived as the answer for people who loved the look of the H1, but didn't want to live with military-level roughness. It was still big, still imposing, still square enough to look like a fortress, but with smoother lines and a more real-world feel. More importantly, the price was far easier to swallow, around $50, making the H2 the Hummer people could actually buy with a high salary without needing to be a collector or ultra-wealthy. And just as GM expected, the H2 became the best seller, the vehicle that took Hummer from an odd luxury symbol to a very real craze on American streets. Then GM opened the door even wider with the H3, smaller, cheaper, aimed straight at the customers who wanted to have a Hummer as a personal signature, but still needed a sensible vehicle for everyday life. The H3 was the promise that you could own the Hummer attitude without paying the brutally high price of before, both in money and in inconvenience. Strategically, this was the way to turn an offbeat brand into a product lineup that could breathe on sales volume. And in 2006, Hummer hit its sales peak with more than 70,000 units sold. In GM's massive picture, that number didn't outshine its mainstream pickup lines. But for a quirky, controversial brand that was deliberately different like Hummer, it was an astonishing milestone. But right after Hummer hit its peak, the story began to change its tone. What had once been seen as a symbol of strength suddenly became a target of ridicule on the street. It was still tall and imposing, but in many people's eyes, the Hummer was no longer freedom anymore. It was a sign of an exaggerated lifestyle, a super-sized lifestyle, wasteful consumption, and a kind of confidence that made others uncomfortable. The environmental backlash surged like a wave. Hummer owners started running into things that were everyday but openly hostile. Getting eggs thrown at their vehicles when parked, getting tires slashed, getting keyed, leaving a long scratch like a deliberately inflicted wound. In Los Angeles, there were times when dealerships were attacked by protesters and even had vehicles set on fire, turning a consumer product into a social flashpoint. Those images spread through the press, and each time they spread, the brand lost another layer of its aura. But what truly killed the Hummer wasn't just emotion. It was the macro numbers starting to tighten their grip. The Iraq War brought oil instability and gas prices soaring, turning the act of driving a vehicle famous for drinking gas into a public burden. People weren't just paying at the pump. They were paying with the looks from neighbors and co-workers. Then came the 2007 to 2008 financial recession, when consumer psychology shifted from showing off to bracing for impact. The things that once stood for, I can suddenly became the question, should I? At the same time, GM fell into crisis because of its own bloated structure. Too many sub-brands, too many costs, too many projects competing internally. In 2009, GM entered a moment no American automaker ever wants to relive. But history doesn't forget. Filing for bankruptcy. When a giant corporation has to seek protection, everything inside gets examined under the cold light of accounting and survival strategy. At that point, Hummer was given the cruelest label in the meeting room: a marginal brand, a fringe brand. It wasn't the line that kept the corporation alive, not the heart of its technology, but something that consumed marketing and R&D budgets while carrying an increasingly heavy image risk. In an era when people weighed every gallon of gas and every dollar in their wallets, Hummer became an all-too-obvious burden. And then, the plan at the time was to sell the brand to recover whatever value remained rather than extinguish it by hand. A deal that seemed like it would save Hummer emerged. A sale to Tangzhong, a company from China. The news sounded like a strange script twist. An icon that was so American might change hands to a rising market, as if history wanted to try a different road. But that deal ultimately failed. When the transaction collapsed, GM no longer had any clean options left. With no buyer, there was no reason to keep pouring money into a name that was losing its pull. And there was even less time to wait for the market to circle back to gas guzzlers. By 2010, Hummer officially came to a stop, shutting down Hummer production completely. Up to this point, the Hummer felt like a relic, a fossil from the cheap gas era when people believed the bigger it was, the safer it was, the heavier it was, the more American it felt. It sits in memory like the hard slam of a door closing on a bygone era. But American car history rarely ends with a period. It usually ends with an ellipsis, and then returns in another form. From around 2013 onward, the full-size SUV market rebounded noticeably. Americans returned to vehicles that were tall, wide, and versatile. And what's interesting is that even luxury brands that had once stayed out of it jumped in. Rolls-Royce, Lamborghini, and a long list of other names. That says one thing clearly: the desire for presence on the road never disappeared. It only stepped back for a while, waiting for the right moment. And GM, after that hard fall, no longer wanted to live on the past. GM's new era was called electric vehicles. EVs weren't just technology, they were a survival strategy. From emissions laws and environmental pressure to the race for brand image. In that context, the name Hummer suddenly became an opportunity. If Hummer was once hated for gulping gas, then today flipping that prejudice on its head creates media pull. Hummer can return as a symbolic rebirth. Still big, still imposing, still a declaration on wheels. This story becomes even more beautiful when you think back to Arnold. He once pulled the Humvee from the battlefield onto the streets with the weight of his fame. And years later, the idea of converting an old Hummer into an electric vehicle also became an image of its time. Not rejecting the past, but transforming it. If Hummer comes back as an EV, the message won't be, "I can go anywhere because I'm stronger, but I'm still me." But I understand the times have changed from fighting wars to fighting global warming. No longer a symbol of a thirst for gas, but the most intriguing question in American car culture. Can a legend once buried by its own nature come back to life by becoming the exact opposite? If you also love classic American car stories, hit like to support the channel and subscribe so you don't miss the next episodes about Detroit legends. Let me know in the comments. To you, is the Hummer a symbol of freedom and strength, or a lesson from an era that went too far? Have you ever driven one, ridden in one, or only seen it roll down the street and never forgotten it? Share a memory of yours down below. And if you know anyone who ever owned an H1, H2, or H3, share this video with them. See you next time.